Welcome to the Danube Institute. I'm Melissa O'Sullivan, Deputy Director of Danube. I'm here along with my colleagues, John O'Sullivan, Istvan Kiss, Gergely Debussy, Christoph Veres, and a host of others, the all-important Lutza, Lily, Linda, without whom none of this happens. Tonight we're so excited to be able to welcome not just Michael Walsh, but also his dear wife, Kate Walsh, who's just flown in from Ireland to join us. Michael Walsh is a man of parts. For our Hungarian friends, this expression means a man who excels in multiple fields or endeavors. Michael is a journalist, an author, a musician, and a screenwriter. He's a graduate at the Eastman School of Music. He was for 16 years the music critic and foreign correspondent for Time magazine, for which he covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and has his piece of the commemorable wall itself as he was up there hammering it. And he covered the fall for and the collapse of communism for Time magazine. His works include the novels As Time Goes By and All the Saints, which was the winner of the 2004 American Book Award for Fiction, and the best-selling Devlin series of NSA thrillers. If that weren't enough, he also is the author of two bestsellers, nonfiction, The Devil's Pleasure Palace, and its sequel, The Fiery Angel. Tonight, you will see the storyteller Michael and the pianist Michael as he weaves together a selection of Liszt pieces, which features prominently in his next novel. He will tell the story behind the music, and in his words, he invites you on a journey through a new realm of musical thought. My husband John and I were delighted to be able to support this event by providing the beautiful Bösendorfer concert piano, working with the excellent people at the Budapest Piano Salon. So now, in the best tradition of Roger Scruton, we'll celebrate beauty, and I introduce Michael Walsh.
Hölgyeim és uraim, nagyon köszönöm, hogy eljöttek ma este, hogy együtt ünnepelhesszük Magyarország egyetlen Liszt Ferencének a 213. születésnapját. A 19. század egyik legnagyobb alakját, valamint szeretném megköszönni a Danube Institute-nak is ezen eseményi támogatását. Thank you. That's as far as my Hungarian goes, but I'd like to thank everyone here at the Danube Institute for making this event happen, and thank all of you for coming tonight. Today is Liszt's 213th birthday, as I think I said in Hungarian. I'm not 100% sure, but somebody will tell me, I'm sure, if I'm not. Tomorrow is my 75th birthday, so Liszt and I almost share a birthday. And tomorrow, of course, is the beginning of the Hungarian Revolution. So congratulations to all of you for that great, great event in 1956. Liszt is probably the most famous Hungarian musician, Bartók perhaps a close second, but he was a man of the 19th century. His lifespan went from 1811 to 1886. He died just short of his own 75th birthday. But what he managed to accomplish in that time was truly startling and amazing. He was a prolific composer. Of course, he was the one who wrote the Hungarian Rhapsodies using gypsy melodies, which became world famous, and showpieces for pianists all over the world. He wrote symphonies. He wrote the Transcendental Etudes, which are 12 of the hardest piano pieces in the literature, and they are the measure by which every pianist is taken who tries them. He himself was the most famous pianist of the day. In fact, you could say that he invented the very concept of the piano virtuoso. For example, it's to Liszt that we owe the way the piano is situated here. Earlier, pianists, if they played solo recitals at all, which they mostly did not do, the piano would have been turned halfway around so that the keyboard would be facing you and the pianist's back would be to you. Well, Liszt didn't have much use for not being able to show off and wink at every beautiful girl in the audience while he was playing. So he turned it around so he could wink and nod and mug, and there are many caricatures of Liszt with his hands flying. He's got 18 fingers on each hand, and he's got enough time to turn and look to cast a glance at little Miss Wright as he was playing. He was a famous womanizer, in case you haven't figured that out. He put Casanova and Byron to shame, I would say. He had notorious liaisons with two women he did not marry. He never married, in fact. He ran off as a young man in his early 20s with the slightly older French Countess Marie d'Agoult. And together they had 3 children while they were living out the dream of romance in Switzerland and Italy and across Europe. And that experience was put into pieces he called the années de pèlerinage, the years of pilgrimage. And so his 3 children were born and promptly shipped back home to Mama, who was in Paris, that is his Mama. And so they were raised really without a mother and father, which had terrible consequences for him later on in life. He also, during his touring virtuoso days, when he went all over Europe, he went to Ireland, he went to St. Petersburg, Russia, and he went to the Ukraine, where he met Countess Caroline von Wittgenstein, and they began a liaison that lasted for a good 20-plus years. It was a very intense relationship, and they thought about getting married, and then they decided to get married. And at this point, Liszt was personal friends with just about everybody, the crowned heads of Europe, and the Pope himself. So Liszt went to the Pope and asked for an annulment for Marie because of some technicality. She'd been married in the Catholic Church. And Liszt, despite his freewheeling lifestyle, was a very devout Catholic. And this annulment was granted. And so on October 22nd, Liszt's birthday, he and Caroline were prepared to get married when the Vatican changed its mind and left them both standing at the altar. And that was the end of that relationship. They remained very close, but didn't live together anymore. And Caroline stayed in Rome writing endless reams of books. And Liszt divided his last 25 years among Rome, Weimar, which I'll get to in a minute, and here in Budapest. As you know, he became the director of the conservatory here and really brought that institution into being. And the Hungarian monarchy gave him an apartment right around the corner from it on Andrássy. And so if you care about Liszt, and if you've never been to that museum, I urge you to go to it. In preparation for this event tonight, I went to all of the Liszt sites I could get to. This journey started in London at the Beefsteak Club, which is a very exclusive dining club in London, at a dinner at which Liszt was the guest of honor, and he was hosted by the great actor Sir Henry Irving and Sir Henry Irving's partner, Ellen Ternan, and Sir Henry Irving's private secretary, who was none other than Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. So this brings us back to Hungary and Transylvania, starting at the Beefsteak Club. From there, I went to Weimar, where Liszt spent many years, twice, having two separate residences. It was broken by a few years of not being in Weimar. He was the Kapellmeister to the Grand Duke. He lived in a big, big house called the Altenburg, where he lived with Caroline Stein-Wittgenstein. And he became a teacher, because after he met Caroline, she convinced him, probably because she knew that he wouldn't change his ways with women, so she convinced him to stop touring and to settle down and concentrate on composing. So he did, and he went to Weimar to become not only a composer, but also the court conductor. He became friends with Richard Wagner, later who became his son-in-law. He premiered many important pieces in Weimar. He honored the spirit of Goethe and Schiller, who were both from Weimar. Goethe's house, in fact, was very close across the park there from Liszt's own second residence, which is called the Gärtnerei, when he came back later in life. So you see, he was a man of culture. He was honored by every government. In the museum here in Budapest, you see these proclamations and plaques and honors that he received from just about everybody. But what's the mystery, right? The mystery was that around 1861, when he's 50, he has a kind of life crisis. The marriage to Caroline falls through. The Pope, who he was very close to personally, had double-crossed him for political reasons. It had nothing to do with morality. Very little in Liszt's life had anything to do with morality. But it was politically awkward for the Pope to allow this marriage to continue because of relations with the Russian monarch, and it gets very complicated and boring. But it shook Liszt to the core, and he suddenly stopped everything he had done, except chase girls, of course. That remained constant throughout his life. He stopped showing off. He stopped being a virtuoso pianist. He stopped composing showy piano pieces, mostly, and he started concentrating on religious music for the Catholic Church. And he wrote mass after mass after mass. His major piece, which was premiered at the Vigadó here, was The Legend of Saint Elizabeth, about the Hungarian Saint Elizabeth. He had great success with that, although that music has not really entered the repertory to the extent that his piano music has. But he banged away at it and banged away at it and became very spiritual, and he became so devotional that, again, in the museum up the street here, there over by the conservatory, you see he's got a little prière-dieu that you just kneel at, and his rosary is there. There's a crucifix there, and it was a place for him to pray privately. He lived rather simply. For all the money he made, he gave most of it away. In fact, he gave a lot of it and raised a lot of it to the city of Pest during the Great Flood in the mid-19th century, when the city was underwater. The Danube had frozen over during the winter, and in the spring rains, it just completely overflowed its banks, and it was terrible destruction. So Liszt immediately went on the concert tour, not for himself, but to raise money for the city of Pest. And it's one of the reasons he was honored, in effect, as a native son, even though, as you all know, he never learned Hungarian. I think I just spoke more Hungarian than Liszt ever did in his life. But he considered himself Hungarian. He's from the town called Riding in what's now in extreme eastern Burgenland in Austria. He considered himself Hungarian. The Hungarian Rhapsodies made his reputation as a Hungarian composer. When I was here, I had the honor to be here a few years ago at John and Melissa's behest, and I did a talk about what makes Hungarian music Hungarian. And it occurred to me that it was the sound of it, not the melodies, none of the superficial stuff, but it was the deep resonant tones that Hungarian composers love. So they love low Liszt does this in, say, the Hungarian Rhapsody No. 3. Lots of octaves in the very lowest register of the piano. Bartók, Kodály, all of these composers have a distinct sound that once you listen for it, you hear, that's Hungarian music. It's different from German music. It doesn't sound like German music, not only in the way it's structured and composed, but in the melodies themselves, which Bartók, as you know, went all over Hungary, which was much, much larger in those days, collecting folk tunes that were not Zigeuner music, but rather authentic Magyar music. So Liszt is part of that movement as well. In 1881, he had another life-changing experience. I should mention first that he became so devotional in Rome that he took 4 of the holy orders on his way to possibly becoming a Catholic priest, which seems kind of amazing. But the 4 holy orders were porter, doorman, that was the title, lector, reader, exorcist. What a great gig. You can get to be the exorcist. If it's only 3 steps up the ladder before you become a priest. And acolyte. And he wore a cassock for the rest of his life and a collar like a priest. And he was allowed to call himself the Abbe, A-B-B-E, accent. So he was the Abbe Liszt, henceforth. Man of faith, man very familiar with the sins of the flesh, great composer whose music wasn't being played as much, great pianist but retired from the stage. And then in 1881, he was back in Weimar in his capacity as a teacher. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of Liszt is, as I said, he didn't work for pay after a while. He gave the money away. He traveled third class. He was rather Spartan in his personal life. If you go to any of the museums, there's one in Weimar, there's one in Bayreuth where he died and is buried, and there's one here. You'll see it's a very simple lifestyle. Now, it's filled with goodies that he was given over the course of his career. But himself, he just had a simple single pallet bed, and he had his place to pray. One thing that's interesting about the museum here is he has a writing desk that has, I think thanks to Bösendorfer, the piano maker here, has a built-in little mini 3-octave keyboard. So if he wanted to compose at that desk or just monkey around, he had a keyboard literally right where the drawer of the desk would be. And another observation about these pianos. You see this piano here, it's not the biggest piano in the world. It's a good sturdy size, perfect for this room. But Bösendorfer and Steinway in New York, Chickering, another piano maker, European piano maker of the time, they all competed with each other to give him pianos because he demanded so much of the instrument that he would literally pound them to pieces sometimes on this. He was like the Who, smashing their instruments against the wall. He would hit the piano so hard, strings would go flying, the thing would collapse. And so he kept saying, I want a better instrument, and I demand a better instrument, and I'm going to write pieces for it, and you're going to do it for me. And they did. You'll see in his various museums many of the pianos that were given to him. There are 2 big Chickering pianos, for example, here. In Bayreuth, there is a huge Steinway. It's a 9-footer at least, that Steinway made for Wagner, but remember Wagner, as I'll mention in a minute, was his son-in-law. So that sits in the place of honor right there in that central rotunda of Wahnfried in Weimar. He had Steinways, he had all sorts of pianos, and they came to him for free because his endorsement of it would make that piano manufacturer a fortune. So that's something that he did as well. But as I say, in 1881, he was at what we call the Gärtnerei, the gardener's house. It's a nice little villa on the edge of the park. And as he was coming out of his first floor apartment. To the Americans, that'd be the second floor, up a flight of stairs. They're kind of windy stairs, and he fell down the stairs and almost killed himself. He was very seriously injured by this, and it took him ages to be able to come back from it. Now, why did he fall? This has been a big question. It's possible he just fell. He was getting older, and you get less steady on your feet when you get older. Two, and something we forget in our modern, rather abstemious age, is he drank amazing amounts of alcohol. These people started drinking from the moment they woke up to the moment they passed out at night. And it wasn't just him, it was everybody. But he was notorious for the amount that he could drink and not have it affect his playing at all. But it's possible he had had a lot to drink, and he wasn't playing as much, obviously, as an older man as he was when he was younger. It's also possible that he had a cataract in his left eye, which was blinding him. And cataract surgery was just beginning. There were a couple of brothers in Germany, somewhere up around Leipzig, who began to work on problems of the eyes, both the cataract operation itself and the lens that would be inserted into the eyeball to replace the old cataract. But this blindness was very much frustrating him, and he couldn't really compose or couldn't see very well. And it's possible that this tumble down the stairs was occasioned by age, by alcohol, and by blindness. I mentioned Wagner. Wagner is the sort of Napoleon of music. He's everywhere. He's inescapable. He's a monster who took over, ate the planet Earth. He was a mad egotist. He was a notorious anti-Semite. He was demanding. He slept with other men's wives because why not? They owed it to him. He took people's money and never paid it back. He sucked up to the king of Bavaria, who was a closet homosexual and we think probably fell in love with Wagner on some level. He got that king to build him the theater in Bayreuth in northern Bavaria, and generally subsidize his lifestyle, which was wasteful, profligate, and extremely expensive. Now, how did he meet Wagner? Well, he met Wagner, who was only 3 years younger than him, during all the tumult of the revolutions in Europe during the 1840s, the late 1840s. And Wagner was a political radical, a strong man of the left, very anti-monarchical, even though, as you can see, he didn't let that stand in the way of getting free stuff from the king. And at this time, Liszt was teaching, and I've mentioned his teaching career, and he was producing in his atelier the best pianists who dominated Europe for the next 100 years, really. And one of them was Hans von Bülow, who was a great pianist and a great conductor, and he became Liszt's prized pupil. And he married Liszt's daughter. Liszt had the 3 children I mentioned. 2 of them died. There was an older girl and a younger boy who died within a few years of each other, just in their youth, in their 20s. But his middle daughter, Cosima, lived forever. She lived well into her 90s. And as it happened, she fell in love with von Bülow, who was inconveniently married to somebody else, but she didn't let that stop her. After all, she was Liszt's daughter, for goodness sake. So she ran off with Hans von Bülow. Big scandal. In fact, she was still living with von Bülow while she was having Wagner's children, one of Wagner's children. So it was an open scandal, and the pair were pilloried. All of them were pilloried. Von Bülow was a cuckold. Liszt is the doddering old father who doesn't know what's going on. Wagner's the evil genius, and Cosima is the siren who stole him away from von Bülow's wife. That marriage actually turned out rather well. Cosima became devoted to Richard. And as Wagner's career progressed, and after he was no longer wanted for various political insurgencies, Liszt was extremely generous with them. It damaged his already very poor relationship with Cosima, who, after all, had grown up without a father, so she had a kind of arm's length relationship with him. But she couldn't resist the charms of Wagner, not that he was handsome, he wasn't, but that he was such an overwhelming genius and changed so much about orchestral and operatic music from the middle of the 19th century to his own death in Venice a couple of years before Liszt. Cosima, at the end, after Wagner had died, was stuck with the Wagner Festival, which had started to premiere the Ring of the Nibelung cycle, and was continuing. It was a money-losing proposition, but Cosima was so devoted to her late husband that she had to keep it going. And so she put on, for this particular festival in 1881, 2 works of Wagner. One is Tristan, and the other was Parsifal, Wagner's last opera. These 2 works affected Liszt terribly much, and you're going to hear it in some of the pieces that I'm going to play. He became entranced by Wagner because Wagner took what he had done as a pioneer in harmony, and especially in harmony, and took to a whole nother level that Liszt could never have dreamed of or imagined or done himself. So Wagner just helped himself to Liszt's music, basically, including the famous Tristan chord, which appears fleetingly in Liszt's Faust symphony. But Liszt didn't hold it against him. Rather, he inserts references to both Tristan and Parsifal into his late music. And now his late period is what we're going to be hearing a little of tonight. It's, as an old man, as I said, something had changed when he fell down the stairs. One of the things that changed was he was no longer the flashy virtuoso composer. His music began to get stripped down, smaller and simpler and smaller and slower, and almost to a vanishing point. And Liszt forecasts, adumbrates the music that's coming. Without Liszt, there's no Debussy, as you'll hear in a minute. Without Liszt, there's no Schoenberg, there's no 12-tone system, there's no atonal music. All the way through Darmstadt, without Liszt, it doesn't happen. Now you can say, well, I wish it didn't happen, and many audiences do sometimes when they come into contact with 12-tone music. But Liszt points the way. So what's the mystery of Liszt is how he transforms himself from this showman, this one of the handsomest men on the planet. If you see his portraits in the museum here, you'll see what I'm talking about. This idol of millions, this chick magnet. He was like the Beatles or Frank Sinatra. The women would scream when they saw him approach the keyboard. How he goes from that into this austere monk who lets himself go, and he loses his looks, and he gets fat, and his warts just get bigger and bigger, and he can barely shuffle along in his slippers. But he's writing this mysterious, futuristic music that no one knew what to do with. Let's hear a little of it. This is a piece called Nuages Gris, Gray Clouds, from 1881, that determinative year of 1881. That's a good place to start with what we're going to be hearing throughout. One of the things that Liszt does is he uses what we call the tritone in music to build around. And the tritone is the exact center of the octave. So if the octave is, right, the exact center of it, when we figure in the black keys, is this. It's an unstable interval. It's like a flat fifth. And the problem with the tritone, or the advantage of the tritone, is you can modulate from it in almost any direction you want because it doesn't know where it wants to go. Think of the tritone as nuclear material. It's highly explosive, but right now it's inert. We don't know where we're going with that. Later on, Saint-Saëns will pick that up and put it in the danse macabre, and it'll be practically the entire danse macabre itself is a variation on the use of the tritone. So you notice that Liszt uses it here in this. There it is. So what key is that in? Is it in G minor? I don't know. Is it E flat? G minor is probably the closest, but because of that, it can turn into that, or and then resolve to, or any direction you want to go. So as you heard in Nuage Gris, it's just nothing. It's like a wisp of clouds. It's that one little monochromatic melody that just fades away. And those last two enigmatic chords are just so typical of what Liszt's after now. He wants you to listen through it, okay? Don't listen to it, listen through it. Liszt famously said at the end of his life, "I have thrown a lance as far into the future as I can." That what I'm going to show you, I'm too old, I'm Moses, I'm not going to get to the promised land, but I've showed you the way by throwing this lance. So again, the music becomes simple and slow, and he just wants you to listen to the sounds. It's almost like John Cage, when you think about it. John Cage, the American composer, wrote a piece called, I think it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And what does it consist of? Nothing. The pianist comes out and sits down for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Then he gets up. That's it. That's the piece. So you can think, oh, charlatanism, ridiculous, stupid. But that wasn't Cage's point. I happen to be one of those who used to think it was charlatanism and stupid. But now I understand better than I did when I was a music critic that what Cage is saying is, listen to the silence. All music is going to end in silence eventually. So now Liszt starts to compose these very, very simple, seemingly simple songs. Songs, piano pieces. And he wrote a piece in, oddly enough, 1881, called the Wiegenlied, German for cradle song, lullaby, right? And he liked this tune so much that he later put it into his final tone poem. He was inventor of the tone poems. In the 13th tone poem, you've heard Les Préludes, for example, one of the more famous of the tone poems. The last one is called Von der Wiege bis zum Grabe, from the cradle to the grave. He's writing this as an old man. And the question has come up among Liszt scholars, did he know he was dying? Well, does anybody know they're dying? You may know there have been changes. You may know there are physiological differences between your older self and your younger self. But do you know you're dying? Probably not. But I don't know. I hope not to find out, frankly. But here it is. This is the vegan lead. So it's done as a piano piece, but it becomes the main theme of the last tone poem. And that is about birth, life, all the storms and troubles of life, and death. And this tune, of course, comes back at the end. The last note of that piece, the way it's written, is just this simple E. And it's not only a whole note, it's two whole notes tied together across the bar with a hold musical notation for hold the note directly above it, so that in effect he wants you to let that last note ring to infinity. This is what he's now after. What's on the other side? What's infinity? How can I evoke that in my listeners' ears So he becomes obsessed with this idea of infinity. And how do you express it? Well, for one thing, graphically, a whole note looks like this, 0, right? If it has a line through it, which an E does in the middle of the keyboard, that sort of breaks that up. But if it's on a space, it is infinity. It might as well be the sign for infinity. And he ends a lot of his music with these techniques to make you listen through the music. I mentioned Wagner, and Wagner's operas, Tristan and Parsifal. Tristan is, of course, one of the pivotal works in musical literature. It, again, takes harmony and fractures it. It delays gratification. The famous love scene in Act 2, for example, of Tristan is the two lovers meeting, the illicit lovers meeting in the middle of the night in a forest, and the music works itself up into this erotic frenzy that you all know from hearing the prelude and Liebestod from Tristan, which has become an orchestral staple. But the music just continues to grow and swell in this very graphic manner, and just as it's about to climax, boom, it cuts itself off because the hubby has showed up, and this tryst is now over. So the ultimate gratification of the lovers is suspended now for another act and a half, and we will only get to it, this is very Wagnerian, in death, that Tristan will die of a wound he receives, in part because of this act with Isolde, and he's waiting for her, and we hear a shepherd piping as the third act of Tristan opens. We hear on the English horn a shepherd who's looking out for Isolde. Isolde is an Irish princess. She's been married off to King Mark and in Cornwall, and Tristan is at his castle in Brittany. So it's an all Celtic opera. And Tristan is mortally wounded, but he's holding out hopes that Isolde will come to him before he dies. And she gets there, but of course not in time. He dies, and she sings the famous Liebestod, love death, over his body, and then she expires herself, and that's how the opera ends. But to say this opera changed music is to underestimate its impact on both the dramatic art, because Wagner wrote his own librettos in addition to writing music, but it changed everything about the way the Romantics saw the world. I'd like to interject here before we hear the next two pieces. It's my theory, as I've listened to music now professionally since I was 22 and been playing the piano since I was 5, and I've lived in a musical world as much as the literary world that I now inhabit. But I think music is actually the more underrated and the more important of the two arts, and I think we've lost that, in part because of Schoenberg and the 12-tone school that drove audiences out of the concert hall. So that didn't quite have as happy an ending as it might have. But also because music doesn't drive the culture the way it used to. And the same can be said about Hollywood, by the way. Hollywood no longer drives the culture. It's a dead art form. And it's dead of suicide, which is a whole nother lecture, I think. But music has a way of influencing philosophy. Wagner thought of himself as a poet and a philosopher, not really a composer primarily or exclusively, but as all these things. Liszt saw himself as this visionary, the music of the future, they were called. Liszt and Wagner especially, and they were opposed by the more conventional school of Brahms, for example, and Schumann. We enjoy all their music today equally well, but they were at loggerheads with each other in public print, arguing about it, concerts, riots, all this kind of thing that no longer attends the arts in our Western society because we've effectively abandoned them. But these next two pieces were written during Liszt's last visit to Venice. And Venice was where Wagner and his wife Cosima and their children and their servants and their dogs and goats and pigs and chickens and ponies and everything else they had, took rooms in the Palazzo Vendramin in Venice on the Grand Canal. And so Liszt, the son-in-law, came down. He had a fraught relationship now with his son-in-law, in part because of how he met his daughter and married his daughter, and in part because they had grown apart. Wagner was now a much, much greater composer than Liszt, universally acknowledged, had just finished what turned out to be his final piece, and Liszt was prevailed upon to come down and spend some time with them in Venice. And while he was there, he was in his own suite of rooms, and he looked out the window and he saw a gondola, all draped in black, sailing silently along the canal. Lugubre gondola, the death gondola, that it was a funeral of somebody. And you know how the Romantics were. They see signs and portents everywhere. The ancients saw it in comets and earthquakes and eclipses. The Romantics saw it in signs of nature and in foreshadowings of fate. They were great believers in fate. So Liszt saw this gondola go by, and he immediately sat down and wrote two pieces called La Lugubre Gondola 1 and 2. And especially in 2, which was actually written first, we hear Wagner. And he knows somehow that Wagner is not long for this world. Now, Wagner was ill. He had heart trouble. We would have diagnosed it as the angina that he had as coronary artery disease, and he could have been saved. But he died of a heart attack in 1883. But Liszt somehow senses that Wagner is going to die. So he writes both these pieces, and I'll play them back to back because they're the same melody, but you'll see how Liszt changes it and transforms it. The one great thing he did as a composer was to perfect the art of transformation of melody. And I think in this he's greater than Wagner, because Wagner doesn't do that. He has little tunes. Who was it? I think Debussy that called them calling cards. So you know what the various leitmotifs are when you're listening to The Ring, for example. Bum 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 bum, you know, or Siegfried's call. Boom boom boom. You every time they show up, you know what that symbol means. Liszt didn't do that particularly. He does kind of that in the Faust Symphony, which influenced Wagner. But he had a way of taking a melody and turning it sideways, upside down, every which way, so that by the end of the piece it's completely different from the way it started. And I'll mention a good example of this later. But in these two pieces, back to back, Lugubre Gondola 1 and 2, we'll hear Tristan. Tristan reference, I'm sure, because it comes back twice, once here. That's the English horn tune at the beginning of Act 3 of Tristan. That's Tristan hearing through his dying senses the sound of the piper who's on the watch for Isolde, who won't come. You also notice that it comes back at the end to lead into, it leads us into all this chromaticism. Very Wagnerian chromaticism that leads us into the big tune in the middle. As it goes forward. It gives you the sense of the rolling of the gondola as it sails down the canal. He tried to get at that in the first Trower gondola by the 6/8 rhythm, which is how composers traditionally show movement on water. Liszt decides in the second version, which is the first version that he wrote, he'll do it in common time, in 4/4 time. But he'll give you this feeling of swinging water. But it's always colored by a device that's very common among romantic composers, which is going, as the song says, how strange the change from major to minor. As soon as that minor note comes in, we go from F sharp minor to F sharp major to F sharp minor. It's what Bartók does, for example, in, I think it's the sixth door of, thank you. It's what Bartók does in the fifth and sixth doors of Bluebeard's Castle, his great one-act opera, that as Bluebeard is showing Judith the great water that he commands, the great riches that he commands, these major chords fade into minor chords every time. It tells you that her fate will be decided not in a very good way for her, that no matter how much she loves this man, it's always going to be colored by this misery of the minor note, and that will spell her doom, as it does at the end of the act. You'll also notice there's the tritone. Our friend makes an appearance. One last thing about Liszt's technique is that he likes the diminished chord as much as anybody. That is to say, major chord, minor chord, diminished chord. He likes the augmented triad. Again, it's an unstable musical device that can resolve, but it's something about this sound that really begins to obsess him in his later life. The way it's built is very simple. In music, we have the diatonic scale, and a major third is A to E, a minor third is A to E flat. That's a minor third. Then a diminished fifth would be two minor thirds together, actually three if you want to go all the way. And an augmented chord is two major thirds. And it gives, again, an instability to it. I mentioned that Wagner died shortly after this. And Liszt reflected that in these two lugubre gondola pieces. And then in the close of his own life, he writes one last piece that I think just sums up what we've been talking about tonight. He wrote it for one of his students. He was very close to his students. This was, I believe, let's see. This one is dedicated to, no, it doesn't tell me. One of his students, anyway. And it's the last thing he basically writes. He writes a few more things at the end, but this is really goodbye, and it's called Abschied, which means goodbye. It's the farewell. It's the end. And he writes it based on a Russian folk song for some reason that interests him very much. And it reminds me of a Goethe poem. And one I learned when I was a young student learning German in college that stuck with me. And I think both the piece and the poem go together. Let's see. Can I have my cell phone, please? So I'll play the piece first, and we'll conclude with the Goethe poem. I put it on my cell phone. Naturally, it's the 21st century after all, right? And since I don't travel with a printer, I decided to just do this. Yes. No. Okay. Abschied, Farewell, by Franz Liszt. There's a clear echo of Beethoven's Walsh sonata. Walsh, beep-bum-bum. Liszt is evoking the spirit of what's one of the tougher Beethoven sonatas to play in this very simple way. So we'll start again. Über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhe. In allen Wipfeln spürst du kaum einen Hauch. Die Vöglein schweigen im Walde. Warte nur, bald ruhest du auch. It's called The Wanderer's Nachtlied. Over all the hilltops there is rest, and all the treetops you can feel barely a breath. The little birds have fallen silent in the woods. Just wait, soon you too will be at rest. And those lines have always stuck with me. Warte nur. Only wait. Bald, soon. Ruhest du, you will rest. Ah, also. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Michael is willing to take questions. Now, I hope you're anxious to ask some. So can I look around?
Here we are.
Oh, I'm sorry, you didn't hear me. I was saying Michael has agreed to take questions, and if there are any questions, we will give you a microphone to put them to Michael. So can I see any curious hands raising? Yes, gentleman here.
Hi, Michael. That was
Hi, Toby.
very compelling. Thank you. You talked about him using the flattened fifth, or something very similar to it, which I understand was known as the Devil's Interval. It was pretty much banned by the Catholic Church for centuries. And also his interest in infinity and the note, the full note being like an oribus, almost being like a symbol of infinity. Do you think he's getting concerned about his own salvation in this period?
The question is Liszt getting concerned about his own salvation? I think absolutely, yes. I mean, the dual life that he led, this voluptuary, this hedonist, sexual hedonist that he was, contrasted so tremendously with the ascetic life of purity and holiness that he wished he was, that I think his music is obsessed with this. There's a piece called the Chardas Macabre, and it's all tritones. It's just basically a bunch of hammering tritones. Like he's working out this anger with God that he's stuck. As I mentioned, the tritone is halfway through the scale, and we don't know where it's going to resolve. Will it resolve into major? Will it resolve into minor? Will it turn into another tritone? The possibilities are endless. So I think that's a very good observation, Toby. I think it represents the devil in music, certainly did from the time of the Middle Ages and the Church. But I think Liszt was especially susceptible to it. Any other questions? Mate will bring the mic directly
carry the mic, so you
to
don't
you.
have to. I don't want to steal the opportunity.
Oh, come on, there must be somebody. Even criticize my terrible Hungarian. Come on, people. We have someone upstairs there.
Can you say something more or play something about how that very Hungarian low end of the piano
I unfortunately didn't bring a lot of music with me, but I would direct your attention to the third Hungarian Rhapsody, which almost all takes place below middle C on the piano, and these octave left hands. It's very, very striking. I just don't have it in my head or fingers right at the moment. Yes.
Anyone else? I'm just taking the mic.
Observations? Anyone chagrined at the feet of clay that Liszt has, or are we cheered by his eventually salvation? Remember that the poem Faust was really important to Liszt. It's Faust Part 1 by Goethe, and Liszt illustrates it in a kind of program music symphony called the Faust Symphony, in which there are three movements: Faust, Gretchen, and Mephistopheles. And The tritone, of course, will play a very large part in that, but also his method of thematic transformation. Let me show you an example of the thematic transformation, if you don't mind. Okay, this. I don't quite have this whole piece still in my fingers, but I played it last year. It's called the Vallée d'Obermann, the Valley of Obermann. It's based on a novel, a French, very poetic French novel, not much read today, but terribly, terribly influential at this point in Liszt's life, and he took it with him as he ran away with Marie Dagout to go to Switzerland and Italy and all the scenic spots of Europe. The novelist is named Senancourt, S-E-N-A-C-O-U-R-T. And Obermann's Valley is the name of the piece. I think this is the most important piece in the history of the piano literature to this point, that after Vallée d'Obermann, you cannot write traditional classical music in the style of Mozart or Haydn or even Beethoven. Beethoven dies 1827, I think, yeah, 27. Schubert dies in 28, and that's the end of that particular line. And what Liszt does is he comes in and he takes what Beethoven gave him. In fact, there's busts of Beethoven in all of his houses. He loves Beethoven. And the myth was that as a 10 or 11-year-old boy, he was presented to Beethoven, and Beethoven gave him the kiss of consecration, the Weihenkuss, to show that he was passing the torch on to Liszt. Now, that's kind of a fantasy, but it made good PR for Liszt when he was a young child prodigy. But he loves Beethoven, so he takes one of the most famous pieces of program music, that is to say, music that tells a story that we can apprehend, which is the storm movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. We hear the rumbling, we hear the thunder, then we get the lightning and the rain, and then the sky's clear, and then everything is beautiful. And Richard Strauss steals that idea in the Alpine Symphony, when the climbers go up and get caught in a rainstorm at the top of the mountain, and then they come back down. Anyway, Liszt, he isn't painting a picture of the valley. Okay? He's not trying to say, oh, look at this valley. He's taking you into the essence of what this view is. And one of my favorite anecdotes about him is he was being visited. I think he used to go and stay in Rome quite a bit and had various apartments in Rome, including one at the Vatican for a while. One of his students came to see him, and it was sunset over the Villa Borghese where he was staying. Anyway, it was sunset. He's looking out the window at this beautiful sunset and these beautiful trees, cypress trees. The Villa d'Este, so it's outside of Rome, and famous for cypress trees. And Liszt wrote a couple pieces about the Villa d'Este, the fountains of the Villa d'Este and the cypresses of the Villa d'Este. So the student comes, and he wants to play some piece for Liszt. And they're gazing out the window. And you're thinking, they're such, they're the romantics. They're the love of nature, which is so critical to the whole romantic temperament, starting with Goethe and moving on through the French romantics. And then Rousseau is kind of a political romantic. Napoleon, in my new book that's coming out in January, I have a whole chapter on Napoleon, not about the military genius, but Napoleon as the first artist as hero, without whom there's no Beethoven, there's no Heldenleben by Strauss, there's no Byron, there's no Liszt, there's none of these guys who were immortalized in the iconography. Anyway, Liszt says, you want to play this piece, huh? The student says, yeah. He says, looking out the window, he says, play that. So I just want to show you some of the way the themes transform here quickly in Valley Doberman. It starts with this melancholic melody. The second theme is the one that gets transformed continuously, and it goes like this. The first time you see it, it's this way. Storm, it turns into this. then it's gone completely haywire, and it's now turned into this. Thank you very much, everybody.
So finally, my question.
I'm not going to answer in Hungarian. I just want you to explain it.
I'm not asking you to have any plot spoilers, but what role does Liszt play in your new novel? Is he just a
Yes.
background character?
Well, that's a very good question, Melissa. Thank you. The reason I'm here, thanks to these good people, my longtime friends, the O'Sullivans, our longtime friends, Kate and mine, is to work on a new novel. I haven't written a novel for a few years. I've been writing military history books and books about cultural history and how culture affects politics. But at this age, I've decided I have one last novel in me. So I like to tell people it's going to be longer than War and Peace, but funnier than War and Peace. So you'll laugh all the way through it. Liszt is a major character in that novel. I find him to be such an interesting person, as I hope you could tell from my enthusiasm for him and what we talked about today and played. I want him to, I'm not sure how I'm going to show him. I may do it, and I'm thinking about this seriously, as an exchange of letters between the Countess Dagu, his first mistress, and Caroline von Wittgenstein, his second mistress, after he dies, because they both outlived him by a couple of years. And maybe just to let the two women tell us who he was. I think that would be a very interesting way. And yes, I know I'm not a woman, but I could be, right? So that's the answer to that. I think he's going to be a great character, and I'll try to do him justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael, thank you so very much. Now, as a matter of fact, I have a secret. I have an insight into why it was that there were people were not asking questions from the first couple of moments, and it was this. They all wanted to ask the same question, but felt it would be impolite to do so. And that question was, Michael, would you like to play something more, please? And in fact, you did that anyway, so you fulfilled that. Now, faith and works are one of the choice between them, one of the great divisions and disputes in Western civilization. And of course, we know that really there has to be neither one nor the other, but a reconciliation between the two. Faith without works is a kind of lifeless thing, and works without faith just splinter and drivel off into the sand. Here, we are an institution that is voted to intellectual argument, thought, debate, and in particular a defense of Western civilization and culture. Now, it's fair to say that there ought to be, and has been tonight, a reconciliation between those two things. Namely, we have learnt, as through your descriptions of Liszt, and by the way, let me just say, it takes a brave man to come to Budapest to talk about Liszt, but boldness has been your friend, and ours too. So we here, as I say, we talk a lot about defending and protecting advancing Western civilization. But of course, we really ought to be living Western culture and living these things. And that requires people who actually do live them, as you do, and transmit that to us. I would say the English Anglo-Australian art critic was once discussing the way culture was discussed when people were discussing American politics, and particularly the rivalry between Kennedy and Nixon. And what he said was that people praise Kennedy because his courtiers arranged for Vivaldi to be played in the White House, but it was Nixon who could play the piano. Now, I think today we have had somebody who is a practitioner, an explorer in Western civilization, and an explorer in the beauties that it contains. And so, I'm delighted that we were able to present tonight not only things as we normally do, I hope, things which we hope you'll believe in, but things hope you will enjoy, learn from, and cultivate. Michael, thank you very much indeed.